The stairwell had a voice, and for 32 years Vernon Acterberg had been the only person in the building who could hear it. Not literally. Vernon knew the difference between a building talking and a building making noise, and he had long ago stopped explaining the distinction to people who hadn't spent decades learning it. What he meant, when he thought about it in those terms, was that the 7th-8th landing of the Dellmont State Office Building's central stairwell had been saying the same thing in the same place for at least 33 years, and almost nobody had ever been positioned to hear it. He had learned to listen from a man named Otis Freeman, who dictated rather than wrote, a habit from decades of working nights when scribbling notes under emergency lighting had never been practical. Otis carried a small cassette recorder clipped to his belt, and when something caught his attention, he'd thumb the record button and say what he saw plainly and move on. Vernon had inherited 41 of those tapes when Otis retired in 1998. He spent his first 2 years transcribing every one into a binder by hand, typing at night after his shift, because listening to Otis's voice, steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who had run this building through 2 renovations and never once raised about anything, felt like the only proper way to learn what the building had been trying to say for decades. Tape 14, recorded in March of 1991, was the one Vernon came back to most. Asterisk 7th-8th, landing paint again. 3rd time this decade. I've had the same crew paint every landing in the stairwell, and they tell me the 7th-8th wears different. Not more traffic. I've checked the badge logs. No more people use that landing than any other. Something about that spot eats paint. Don't know what. Writing it down so somebody remembers I noticed. Asterisk. Vernon had typed that entry into his binder in his 2nd year on the job, sitting at the kitchen table in his apartment with Otis's voice coming through cheap headphones, and it felt something settle into place that he couldn't fully name at the time. It was the first entry that made the building feel less like a structure he maintained, and more like a structure he was in conversation with. He had gone up to the 7th-8th, landing the next morning, before his shift officially started. He had stood on the 18-inch square of painted concrete, with a fire code required the floor number to be marked, a simple black 7 to 8 stenciled onto pale gray epoxy paint. And he had looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something once you've been told it's unusual and are trying to see the unusual part for yourself. It looked like paint. It looked exactly like every other landing marker in the stairwell. But Otis's voice had said something about that spot eats paint, and Vernon had learned, over 32 years since, that Otis had never once been wrong about anything he'd bothered to say twice. The Dellmont State Office Building had gone up in 1949. 13 floors of load-bearing masonry and steel frame construction, built during an era when government buildings were meant to look permanent. It had been renovated twice. In 1983, a structural update that included a partial column removal on the 7th floor to create a larger conference space, and again in 2011, mostly cosmetic, the central stairwell accepted because stairwells rarely got renovation budget when nothing looked visibly wrong. Vernon had run building operations for 32 years, inheriting a role from Otis the way Otis had described the building to him, patiently letting the structure teach its own habits over time. He knew which floors ran warm in August. He knew the loading dock elevator had a slight hesitation on its 3rd floor stop that had been there since before his time. He knew the central stairwell completely, the way that comes from walking the same 13 flights thousands of times across 3 decades. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that the 7th-8th landing did not behave like the other 12. Every landing needed its floor number repainted eventually. Foot traffic wore the epoxy down over years, and the standard maintenance cycle called for repainting every 6 to 7 years, a rhythm so consistent Vernon could nearly predict which landing was due next just by counting backward. The 7th-8th landing broke that rhythm every single time. Vernon had personally overseen its repainting 9 times in 32 years, nearly every 18 months, more than 4 times the rate of any other landing. He tried 3 different paint formulations over the years, including a high-durability epoxy the facility's budget specifically approved after the 5th repaint, when even his supervisor started asking questions. It lasted marginally longer. It still wore through faster than any other landing by a wide margin. He checked everything Otis's tape suggested checking. Badge swipe traffic logs showed no meaningful difference in foot traffic at that landing compared to any other. He checked for chemical exposure. Nothing. Sunlight exposure. The stairwell had no windows at that level. The idea seemed absurd even as he ruled it out. Moisture, humidity, temperature swings. Every measurement came back identical to the landings above and below. Something about that 18-inch square of concrete was different. He simply didn't know what he had a theory once, in his 11th year, that the wear pattern might be tied to elevator vibration. The stairwell ran adjacent to the building's primary elevator shaft, and Vernon wondered whether the 7th-8th landing sat at some resonant point in the shaft vibration profile. He spent 3 months tracking elevator cycle counts against paint condition, convinced he'd finally found a mechanism Otis's tape never explained. The correlation didn't hold. The 7th floor, despite frequent elevator stops from conference room traffic, showed no meaningful difference in vibration, exposure, compared to floors with comparable landing wear to every other floor in the building. He had been wrong. He wrote it in his own binder, in the same plain style he'd absorbed from transcribing Otis. Asterisk elevator vibration theory. Ruled out. Cycle counts don't correlate with wear differential. Back to unexplained. It bothered him more than he expected. He had wanted the theory to be right. Clean, mechanical, the kind of answer that let you close a question instead of carrying it. Being wrong meant carrying it another decade, at least, with nothing better than what Otis had left him in 1991. Something about that spot eats paint, and nobody knows what. In his 19th year, Vernon started keeping something Otis's tapes never included: precise wear rate measurements. He photographed the 7th-8th landing at 3-month intervals, documenting the degradation with a level of detail Otis's era never captured. What the photograph showed, laid out chronologically, was a wear pattern concentrated in a strange location, not distributed the way foot traffic, where it typically distributes, heavier at the leading edge, tapering toward the corners. The 7th-8th landings was concentrated instead in a narrow diagonal band, roughly 6 inches wide, cutting corner to corner in a way that had nothing to do with how people actually walked across it. He stood in the stairwell one evening, looking at the current paint job, only 4 months old, already showing the beginning of that same diagonal thinning, and felt something he didn't often feel about the building after 3 decades, unease rather than curiosity. A wear pattern following foot traffic told a simple story about people. A pattern ignoring foot traffic told him the building was responding to something he couldn't see. He didn't know what that something was. He only had the diagonal band, appearing fresh in every repainting, in exactly the same 6-inch corridor every time. The modernization announcement came in his 29th year. The State Facilities Division had approved funding for a comprehensive stairwell renovation across all 13 floors of the Dellmont Building. New epoxy coating system, applied as a single continuous process rather than the landing-by-landing repainting the building had relied on for 75 years. The new system's manufacturer specification, which Vernon read carefully once he understood what the project actually involved, described a rigid, high-bond coating designed to eliminate the periodic maintenance cycle entirely. A 20-year warranty. No repainting required. The specification sheet also contained a clause Vernon read 3 times before he fully understood its significance. The warranty explicitly excluded any surface experiencing what the manufacturer termed unusual mechanical stress inconsistent with normal pedestrian use. Any coating failure attributable to such stress would void coverage for that section and, depending on how the coating had been applied, potentially compromise the integrity of the continuous system across adjoining sections. Vernon sat with that clause for a long time in his office, tape 14 playing quietly on the old cassette player he kept for moments when a typed transcription didn't feel like enough. Something about that spot eats paint. Otis had never known what caused it. Vernon, after 32 years and 3 ruled-out theories, still didn't either. But he knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with 3 decades of pattern recognition, that whatever had been wearing through paint at 4 times the normal rate for at least 33 consecutive years had never once, in all that time, met the manufacturer's definition of normal pedestrian use. He brought his case to the modernization project's lead contractor, a firm called Brannigan Structural Finishes, in a meeting scheduled for early spring. He brought Otis's original tape 14, along with a transcription binder, his own 19 years of photographic documentation, and the badge swipe traffic data he'd pulled going back as far as the electronic system allowed. The contractor's project engineer, a careful man named Reuben Kastner, listened attentively and reviewed everything Vernon presented. He pulled up the badge traffic data himself, cross-referenced it against the building's floor plans, and found nothing anomalous in usage patterns at the 7th-8th landing. His conclusion, offered without dismissiveness but with clear conviction, was that the accelerator was most likely attributable to a discontinued paint formulation used in the landing's earlier repaintings, something in an older product's chemical composition reacting poorly with the specific concrete mix used in that section of the stairwell, a batch variation from the original 1949 pour or the 1983 renovation work. It was a plausible explanation. It was also, Vernon pointed out carefully, one that didn't survive contact with his own records. I switched to the high durability formulation myself in year 23, Vernon said. Same batch the building's used everywhere else since. The 7th-8th landing still wears at the same accelerated rate. If it were the old formulation reacting with the concrete, a modern formulation should have solved it. It didn't. Kastner reviewed that data too. He was quiet for a moment. I don't have another explanation, he said, honestly. But the modernization timeline doesn't allow for an open-ended structural investigation based on a wear pattern we can't currently explain. The new coating system is engineered to handle standard structural loads across the entire stairwell. If there's something unusual happening at that landing, the coating should be more than capable of accommodating it. The project proceeded. The single continuous epoxy application across all 13 landings was scheduled for early autumn. Vernon didn't sleep well through that summer. It wasn't only the coating decision. It was a particular shape of doubt that came from being right about something for 33 years without ever being able to say why. At 3 p.m, standing on the 7th-8th landing watching the old paint being ground down in preparation for the new system, he felt certain the pattern was real, the diagonal wear band was real, something was happening in that structure that nobody had properly investigated, and a rigid continuous coating was the wrong thing to apply over it. At 3 a.m, he wasn't certain of anything. He was a facilities operations manager with a box of cassette tapes and a photo album, arguing against an engineered coating system with a 20-year warranty and a badge traffic dataset that agreed with the contractor, not with him. What if Otis's original observation had captured something real that had simply stopped matching, an old formulation problem from a 1949 pour, long since resolved, and what Vernon had been chasing for 32 years was a habit of suspicion rather than an active pattern. He had wanted for years for the diagonal band to mean something structural, something that would validate decades of attention paid to a single 18-inch square of concrete, wanting it to mean something wasn't the same as it meaning something. He pulled his transcription binder off the shelf one more time, late on a Tuesday night in August, and reread tape 14 from beginning. Otis's steady voice on recording, unhurried, certain of what he'd observed and honest about what he hadn't figured out. Writing it down so somebody remembers I noticed. Otis had never claimed to know the cause. He had only insisted the effect was real, worth remembering. Vernon had that same effect, documented now across 3 decades with photographs Otis never had the equipment to take. Not having the cause had never stopped Otis from writing things down, and it wasn't a reason for Vernon to stop now. He requested one more meeting before the coating began. This time he brought something new, a structural engineer, hired privately at his own expense, to review the 1983 renovation drawings against the current stairwell. The engineer's name was Dana Okafor, and she specialized in load path analysis for older masonry and steel frame structures. She spent 2 days with the 1983 renovation drawings before she found what 33 years of paint records had been describing without anyone having the right document to translate it. The 7th floor's conference room expansion, done during the 1983 renovation, had required removing a partial section of load-bearing column to open up the floor plan. To compensate, the renovation had installed a structural transfer beam directly above the removed column section, a standard engineering solution, redistributing the load that column had carried out to surrounding structure instead. The transfer beam ran directly beneath the 7th-8th stairwell landing. Dana explained it to Vernon in terms he could follow without an engineering degree. The The beam was doing its job. It held for over 40 years, code-compliant, structurally sound by every standard measure. But transfer beams under load didn't sit perfectly still. Under certain building conditions, HVAC cycling on the floors above, elevator operation in the adjacent shaft, wind load pressing against the upper floors on windy days, the beam experienced a very slight, entirely code-compliant vibration, transmitted upward to the slab and into the landing directly above it. That vibration was too small to feel underfoot. It would never register on a standard structural inspection because it fell well within acceptable tolerances for the building's overall safety. But it was constant, and it was concentrated in a narrow band directly above the beam centerline, which corresponded. When Dana overlaid the beam structural drawing against Vernon's photographs of the wear pattern, almost exactly to the diagonal 6-inch corridor that had been wearing through paint faster than anywhere else in the building for over 3 decades. Microabrasion, a form of wear too subtle to see happening, too small to measure without dedicated equipment, but cumulative over years of constant low-level vibration, expressing itself the only way it could in a material as simple as painted epoxy, by wearing through faster than the surrounding surface, in exactly the shape of the vibration source beneath it. The badge swipe data had never shown anything, because the cause had never been about how many people walked across that landing. It had been about what was happening in the structure beneath their feet, whether anyone walked across at all. Dana's report went to both Vernon's facilities office and Brannigan's project engineer within the same week. Reuben Kastner called Vernon personally. The rigid coating would have cracked there, he said. Not immediately. Probably within a few years, once the microabrasion pattern reasserted itself under a coating with no give in it. And because it's a continuous application. A crack there could propagate to adjoining landings before anyone caught it, Vernon said. He'd already worked that part out himself, months earlier, reading the warranty exclusion clause for the 3rd time. The project was redesigned. The 7th/8th landing received a specialized flexible coating system engineered specifically to accommodate low-level structural vibration, applied as an isolated section rather than part of the continuous run, with a monitoring sensor embedded beneath the surface that would flag any change in the vibration profile going forward. The rest of the stairwell proceeded with the original continuous system as planned. The modernization project came in 6 weeks behind schedule and moderately over the revised budget. Vernon's supervisor, reviewing the final cost report, asked him directly whether the extra expense had been worth it. Vernon thought about tape 14, about Otis's steady voice insisting on an unexplained pattern he never got to solve, about 19 years of quarterly photographs building toward an answer neither of them could have reached alone. He thought about the difference between a bad traffic dataset that said nothing was wrong and 33 years of paint that kept saying otherwise. The alternative was a crack propagating through a continuous coating system on the primary fire egress route of a 13-story occupied building. Vernon said, I think it was worth it. The binder went into the building's permanent facilities archive that winter, alongside a formal report crediting both Otis Freeman's original 1991 observation and Vernon's 32 years of continued documentation as the basis for identifying a structural condition that had never appeared in any prior inspection or engineering survey of the building. Vernon kept the original cassette tapes. He'd had them digitized at his own cost as a backup. But he kept the physical tapes in a small box in his desk drawer, and every so often, usually late in the evening near the end of shift, he'd pull out tape 14 and listen to Otis's voice again, steady and unhurried, saying the same 11 words that started all of it. Asterisk something about that spot eats paint. Don't know what asterisk. He walked the 7th/8th landing during his rounds away he always had, though it was quieter now, a flexible coating holding steady over a sensor that had, in the 2 years since installation, recorded nothing but the same small, constant, harmless vibration Dana Okafor had predicted it would find. The transfer beam kept doing its job. The landing kept receiving it, absorbed now rather than expressed, the coating flexing instead of wearing. Vernon didn't need Otis's voice to tell him what the landing was saying anymore. He knew. He'd spent 33 years learning to listen for exactly this. Not a dramatic announcement, but a small, persistent pattern, patient enough to survive 3 decades of nobody having quite the right question to ask it until somebody finally did.